I think everybody understands we're at a very difficult time. Matter of fact, we've passed the crossroads in terms of where we are in law enforcement and kind of the situations we're dealing with. We're actually at a period of time, what I would call a paralysis period of time in law enforcement, where law enforcement officers are paralyzed because they're not really exactly sure whatever actions they take, will they be supported by their agency or the leaders of the agency. But what's really interesting is, will they be supported by the communities? And that has put us in a paralysis period of law enforcement. And it's also created a crisis period of law enforcement for us. One of the things that I believe as a leader is that during a crisis period of time, you have to be decisive. And one of the things we have to do is find solutions to the current state that we're in regarding law enforcement and the communities. I come from a law enforcement family. My dad was a deputy sheriff, and he spent 20 some odd years in law enforcement. And I kind of learned, the skill sets of being an initial cop from him, which I used to watch him. He was, back in those days in the 60s, being police was quite different than it is today. But I watched him, and the one thing that I learned from him was the dedication, like being dedicated to a profession that you really didn't care how much you got paid. Although I've obtained rank as police chief and was one for 17 years, really at the core who I am, I'm just a street cop. I've been a practitioner of law enforcement, meaning that I've actually done it. I was on the streets as a cop, a detective, supervisor, moved up the ranks fairly quickly. I've been a police chief. I've been on the front lines of being a police chief. And during all that time, I had to become a student of police work and leadership because I really didn't understand leadership. I moved so quickly that my experience didn't catch up with my rank. So I had to bridge that gap with knowledge, and I had to become a student. And now, since I've retired, I've become a teacher or a purveyor of that information and experiences. So I've had quite the leadership journey, if you will, in terms of over the past 4 decades. And I've had a front row seat to what I believe to be the most interesting time that's ever been in law enforcement. For many years, police have been viewed as heroes. They've been viewed, you talk about the post 9/11 period of time where police were viewed as heroes. They were welcomed everywhere. People said, thank you for your service and those things. You've almost seen a villainization, if you will, of police. And that really has come about because of a number of key issues. What got us here really started back in 1991 with Rodney King. That was the first event that became a nationwide event where unrest in the modern era really took national stage. In 2014, as you had a tipping point that occurred in terms of how the communities viewed police shootings in particular. You had the Eric Garner case, and then you have the Michael Brown case, and then you have the Laquan McDonald case in Chicago. For the first time in modern history, if you will, the media and social media in itself begins to create this narrative of victims, like that the police, people who are involved in police shootings have all of a sudden become victims. They're victims of the police, and that the police weren't justified in their actions. And anytime that a person views someone as a victim, they have a tendency to begin to emotionally connect with that person. And what happened prior to that was that the emotional connectivity was always with the police. In other words, there was a great factor in police that we used every day, trust. And when we had the trust of the public, there was an automatic connectivity to that. When the public in general started seeing people shot by police as victims, then it lowered the trust factor of the police having a justified shooting. And when you have that occur, it creates this dynamic disconnection within the community, which is a major problem for us in police, the disconnections of our communities with us. There's kind of been 3 specific times, if you will, in terms of not just development of police, but you talk about in development of business, development of mindset, development of culture, the 3 ages being the industrial age, and then you have the information age and now conceptual age. But the difference between those ages that during the industrial age and then during the information age, people did not connect to things the way they do now. And people have a tendency in the conceptual age to connect to everything that they do. So they have this huge emotional connectivity that drives them. It drives them in everything they do, which occurred during 2014, if you look at those cases, because they started connecting with Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and Laquan McDonald. They started seeing them as victims of the police, which brought us to the tipping point of now police were viewed more as the villains, not the heroes. Because law enforcement really hasn't progressed to understand that we're in a conceptual age where the individual officer now is larger than the organization. And if you don't believe that, look at the actions of any individual officer. In a moment's notice, that individual officer's actions can shine a light on the organization and draw instant discredit, not only on that agency, but an entire profession. And one of the things in law enforcement that is very difficult to deal with for police chiefs or leaders is what is lawful a lot of times looks awful. And so when it's captured on video, what happens is then it creates this disconnection with what might actually been occurring. And you see this small snippet of video, and then a community's forming their conditional support based on that small incident occurring within 10 or 15 seconds, and then it's creating this conditional support within inside the community. During the last year with George Floyd brought us to a major tipping point of paralysis. And why I say that caused the tipping point of paralysis was that agencies stopped proactive posting. Agencies stopped doing proactive things in the community or letting the community know. If you'll look at that and look at the post prior to George Floyd, I'd guarantee you were seeing hundreds of posts daily. If you're watching websites or if you're watching police, you would see hundreds of positive posts where police were interacting with folks. We, if you will, we were moving slowly towards understanding the conceptual age, but then all of a sudden George Floyd brings us back to where it paralyzes, if you will. And if you look at the number of positive posts, they went dramatically downhill. So now what's happened is we're in this recovery phase. Then you add the pandemic on top of that with COVID, and it has been just an absolute perfect storm of disconnection with the communities and the police. I mean, we're actually seeing calls now for defund the police. We're actually seeing the morale of police agencies are at an all-time low. We're seeing a retention issue where officers are leaving. They're staying in this profession for very short periods of time, and then they're moving. We're having a very difficult time to hiring people. And you talk about the community support is conditional. And those things are causing a great deal of problems in law enforcement where we currently are. Talking to officers across the country and teaching in classrooms and talking to leaders, I just knew there was something missing when it come to the paralysis that we've seen over the last several years, the malaise that you saw, the morale that was at the lowest that I've seen it in years in this profession. And I began to think about it, and I began to think, well, let's go back to the roots of why do we really do this job to begin with. And the reason we do it is because we want to make a difference in our community. We want to make a positive impact. We want to be a part of something really special. And you can only do that if you truly have the heart of a servant. When I developed this servant officer program, I thought about the connection. What are we really at the very core of who we are? And we're community servants. There's no way getting around that. You can't get around the fact that police officers, law enforcement officers in general, are community servants. So why not hit that head on and admit that and start developing people to be community servants? It doesn't mean that we're community subservient or subservient to the community. It means that we partner with our communities and that we serve them in a way of expectations that our profession deserves and our community deserves. What's important to understand is that the servant officer and the servant model officer that we've created is one who fights crime just as diligently and just with as much effort as before, but they have to understand the importance of the levels you fight crime at. There's two levels you fight crime at. The first one is you fight crime at the crime level, and that means that you wait till the crime occurs and then you are very reactive. And then you solve the crime, you use all your analytics, you use all your data, all your skill sets to go out, but you're doing it reactively. That's where we fight crime at the crime level. We do crime prevention programs by putting people in jail. That's where we fight crime at. But there's a second level of crime fighting that the new communities, or most of our new generation of communities, really want us to fight crime at, the fear of crime level. Now, the fear of crime level is where people feel safe. When we fight crime at the fear of crime level, we make a heart connection with our communities. We fight crime at connecting with them. We fight by talking to them. We do proactive policing. We don't wait till a crime occurs. We go out and see where people feel unsafe, and we start creating solutions about that. Every police agency in every community has a responsibility to make people feel like they feel safe. And when you feel safe, you're fighting crime at the fear of crime level. If your communities feel unsafe, then there's a disconnect within that community. And so we have to find a balance between the officer, the warrior officer, who fights crime at the crime level, and the servant officer who fights crime at the fear of crime level. Now, when we look at training as a whole, we look at the curriculum and we look at where we build our legal skill set, where do we build our tactical skill set, where do we build our ability to execute those skill sets. And we never really look at how do we create or help officers develop the skill sets to do their job and connect with people. We don't do that. And so what we have to do now more than ever is help officers focus on what I call people-centric skills and people-centric values that create a servant mindset of the new officer, or the modern officer, if you will. One of the biggest problems that we face every day as a law enforcement officer is how to communicate from a position of authority. That's just one example of one of the problems we face today. We never teach people how to communicate from a position of authority that creates a connection. It always usually ends up with the officer creating an action that usually ends up with some type of either verbal force or physical force. Part of recapturing our narrative is to start focusing on the development of our individual officers. We have to create an officer for the modern era, and that officer has to be a servant or have that servant mindset. The great thing about being a servant officer is that no matter where you are in your career, you can adopt and adapt to this mindset. Being a servant officer really helps you recapture the why you did this job in the first place. This is about a commitment between you, your organization, and your community to make it a better quality of life and to make your community safer and to have people live in peace and harmony. Another component of servant officer is that it has to come from the top. It can come from the bottom of the organization, and officers can be really committed to being of service, but if the top levels of the organization don't have that servant mindset as well, then it's not going to work. Currently, where I see police leaders are, and it kind of reminds me of the story of one of the great sports heroes in America, and that's Wayne Gretzky. And as I began to read about Wayne Gretzky and I started watching him, there's nobody can doubt whether you pull for him or his teams or not, he was one of the most prolific scorers and hockey players of all times. And the one thing that really made the difference in him in his life was training. The one thing that he gives credit to being such a major impact in the sport of hockey was this. When he was young, his dad created these ice skating rinks outside of his house. He would go out there and mark out about a 20 by 40 foot area and pour water on it as the weather got colder. And he would go out there and watch Wayne every day practice. And one day he told Wayne what Wayne credits with probably the most impactful thing his father ever said to him is he said, "Son, when you skate, you got to remember this. You can't skate to where the puck's been. You got to skate to where the puck's going." So one of the things that John Maxwell says, who I have a lot of respect for as a leader, is leaders have to see more than others and before others. We've got to stop chasing the puck to where it was, and we have to anticipate to where the puck's going. And part of that anticipation is understanding that we have to develop the individual officer to create that servant mindset and that servant heart to return us to the foundational principles of law enforcement.